Hey, Farmers Branch family, it's time for Bible study from the big comfy chair. Sorry I'm a little bit late. I lost a little track of time just piddling around. I have no excuse. So I'll try to do better next time. I'm going to take just a second, catch my breath. There we go. Now we are in our study of First Macabees, and as you recall, this is, to me, I believe it is very important historical scripture. I hope some of you downloaded the Bible app and are able to go to the Common English Bible or otherwise have access to it, which is where we'll be reading. That translation does have 1st and 2nd Maccabees, 3rd and 4th Maccabees too. But they're less important. They don't really cover any material that's not covered in 1st and 2nd. It puts a little bit of a spiritual angle on it, which is still important reading. But the two history books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, have some important history in them. And without knowing the history of this period of time in the history of the Hebrew nation, there are parts of the Bible you just won't understand. And I don't think very many of you have downloaded this version. I encourage you to do that. If you don't know how to do that, ask me at church this coming Sunday. But there are portions of the Bible that you just can't make any sense out of. There are several chapters of the prophecy of Daniel that you're just not going to understand unless you know the history of this period. You're not going to know what he's prophesying about. And this is important to know because it is largely the fulfillment of many portions of Daniel and some additional history from history books as well. And it came out just like Daniel said it would. Daniel's prophecy is all about those 77s of years allotted to his people as of the time the order went out to rebuild Jerusalem. And his prophecy is very specific about that time, and its fulfillments are very important to bring in God's Messiah. There are portions of the Revelation you just won't understand unless you know the story that we're reading right now. The story of the two witnesses, with fire coming out of their mouths, and who died dead in the streets of Jerusalem and then are resurrected. That's not talking about two literal people. It's using Moses and Elijah, their characteristics as epitomes of the law and the prophets. And we're reading that portion of Scripture, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, that tells us who those two witnesses are, that they are the law and the prophets. And it talks about the heroic events that led to the resurrection of the two olive trees that feed oil into the light of the Messiah. And pivotal point in history. So I believe we left off in the 4th chapter, and I believe that Lysias so here we're at the 4th chapter and the 36th verse. And remember, we just had Judas Maccabeus and his forces, poorly equipped, few in number, fighting an elite force of 6,000 men and some select cavalry. And it just didn't work out for the Greek ruler like he thought it would. And they were routed. And so now Lysias, the governor of the area appointed by Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, we pick back up. He is going to come back with a larger army, and we're going to read the story of the Maccabean victory. The foreigners who escaped went and told Lysias about all that had happened. When he heard it, he was perplexed and discouraged. Things hadn't happened to Israel as he had intended, and they had not turned out the way that the king commanded. Next year, he gathered together 60,000 select men and 5,000 cavalry, intending to subdue the Israelites. They came to Idumea and camped at Bet-zur. Judas, on the other hand, went out to meet them with 10,000 men. So Judas's forces have gotten stronger. He's up to 10,000 from about 5,000, but he's up against 60,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Overwhelming odds against them. So I'll read on. When Judas saw how numerous their army was, he prayed. In contrast to Bar Kokhba, who said, God, we don't need your help. But Judas prayed. This is his prayer as it's recorded. Blessed are you, Savior of Israel, who crushed the attack of the mighty warrior through the power of your servant David. You handed over the camp of the Philistines to Saul's son Jonathan and the man who carried his armor, and let them be disappointed by their troops and cavalry. Fill them with cowardice, melt away the boldness of their strength. Let them quake in their destruction. Strike them down with the sword of those who love you, and let all who know your name praise you with hymns. Then both sides attacked each other. 5,000 men from Lysias' army died in the fighting. Lysias saw his troops being defeated and took note of the boldness that inspired Judas's troops. How ready they were to live or die bravely. So he withdrew to Antioch and enlisted mercenaries so that he could invade Judea again with an even bigger army. It's not by might, it's not by power. They're just not catching on, are they? Now, what follows in our reading is the story of the rededication of the temple. Second Maccabees will go into some other details, but this will give us the skeleton of the story here. You remember that's the object. This story is the object of the Feast of Dedication, or called Hanukkah, Hebrew word for dedication, and celebrated today. It's always in Christmas. It always begins in late November or early December, and it's celebrated for 8 days. Now, the story of why it's celebrated, the modern Talmudic story of why it's celebrated surrounds, they call it the Festival of Lights because it surrounds a story about a miraculous supply of oil. They only had consecrated oil to light the lamp in the temple for 1 day, but it burned for all 8 days of the dedication. Well, that story doesn't appear anywhere until about 400 years after these events. And I'm not sure why they needed that kind of story to. It doesn't add anything to the spectacular events of the story. So let's read what Hanukkah is really all about. It's not just Jewish substitute for Christmas. It was around before Jesus, and Jesus celebrated it. So it's important for us to know. So in 1 Maccabees 4 and 36, it says, At that time, Judas and his brothers said, Look, our enemies have been crushed. Let's go up to cleanse and rededicate the sanctuary. All the army gathered together and went up to Mount Zion. They found the sanctuary deserted, the altar treated with disrespect, and the gates burned. In the courts, brushes had sprung up like in an open field or on one of the mountains. They saw that the priests' chambers were in ruins as well. So they tore their clothes and mourned with great sorrow. They sprinkled their heads with ashes and fell face down on the ground. When the trumpet sounded a signal, they cried out to heaven. So here they find the two witnesses dead in the streets of Jerusalem, the law and the prophets, the abomination that brought desolation and destruction had been put in place, and the temple had been neglected, abandoned, and spiritually destroyed. So here they find the two witnesses in the epitomes of Moses and Elijah dead, but it's now time for their resurrection. Then Judas chose some soldiers to fight against those stationed in the elevated fortress until he completed cleansing the sanctuary. Now there was an elevated fortress, a citadel built in the city of David by the Greeks. And we'd already read where ruffians and violent men had taken up residence there and were a perpetual problem to those that tried to attend the temple and those in Jerusalem. He selected priests who were blameless and devoted to the law. They cleansed the sanctuary and took the polluted stones to a ritually unclean place. They discussed what to do about the altar for entirely burned offerings since it had been polluted. They decided it was best to tear it down so that it wouldn't be a lasting, shameful reminder to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar. They stored the stones in a convenient place on the Temple Mount until a prophet should arise who could say what to do with them. They then took unfinished stones in keeping with the law and built a new altar like the former one. Now it's interesting that they were awaiting that prophet like Moses who could come and set the altar straight and tell them what to do with those stones that had once been consecrated to God. Well, little did they know that there would be another altar of sacrifice, and there would be a once-for-all sacrifice for sin that would come. That prophet did come. He had no use for those stones. In fact, the stones that were already erected would not be left one on another. And that temple, his body, would be destroyed and then rebuilt in 3 days. They also restored the sanctuary and the temple interior and dedicated the courtyards. They fashioned new holy equipment and brought the lampstand, the incense altar, and the table into the temple, the table of the showbread, into the temple. Then they offered incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, which illuminated the temple. The messianic light burns again. They placed bread on the table and hung curtains. Finally, they completed all the work that they had started. Now, in all this, note that there is no Ark of the Covenant, and there hasn't been one for a long time. They rose early in the morning of the 25th day of the 9th month, the month of Kislev. And you remember, this was the day in the month that the altar had been desecrated. It was the year 148. They offered sacrifice following the law on the new altar for entirely burned offerings that they had made. In the very season, on the exact day that the Gentiles had polluted it, it was dedicated with songs, harps, lutes, and cymbals. All the people bowed to the ground and worshipped and blessed heaven, which had given them success. So they celebrated the rededication of the altar for 8 days and joyfully made entirely burned offerings. They offered a sacrifice of deliverance and praise. They decorated the front of the temple with gold crowns and small shields. They restored the gates and the priest's chambers, furnishing them with doors. The people were extremely glad, and the disgrace the Gentiles brought was lifted. Then Judas, with his brothers and all the assembly of Israel, laid down a law that every year at that season, the dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and happiness for 8 days, similar to the Feast of Tabernacles, beginning with the 25th day of Kislev. And that's why Hanukkah is always at a little bit different time, because of the peculiar nature of the Hebrew calendar. Varies a little bit from year to year, but it's always in the winter. At that same time, the Israelites built high walls and strong towers all around Mount Zion, so that the Gentiles did not come and trample them as they had done previously. Judah stationed an occupying force there as guards. He also built up Bet-zur to protect it, so that the people might have a fortress that faced the direction of Idumea. Idumea being their perpetual enemies. And when the Gentiles living nearby learned that the altar had been rebuilt and the sanctuary had been dedicated just as it was before, they became very angry. They sought to wipe out Jacob's descendants who lived among them, so they started to kill and destroy the people. But Judas waged war on the descendants of Esau and Idumea at Akrabbim because they kept ambushing Israelites. He dealt them a heavy blow, humbling them and taking their goods. He also took note of the wickedness of Ben's sons, who were trapping, catching, and ambushing people on the highways. Judas shut them up in their towers. He camped against them, and by promising their complete destruction, he burned their towers and all who were in them. Then he moved against the Ammonites. He found a strong group with many people and a man named Timothy as their leader. Judas had many battles with them, beat them severely, and struck them down. He also captured Jazer and its villages. Then he went back to Judea. Then the Gentiles in Gilead gathered together against the Israelites who lived in their territory, planning to destroy them. So the Jews fled to the fortress at Dathema. And they sent a letter to Judas and his brothers. The Gentiles around us have gathered to destroy us. They are making preparation to come and capture the fortress to which we've escaped, and Timothy is leading them. Please come and rescue us from them, because many of us have died already. Our people who were in the land of Tob have been killed. The enemy captured their wives, children, and goods. They killed nearly 1,000 people there. And while the letter was still being read, other messengers from Gilead with torn clothing said similar things. They related that the people of Ptolemais, Tyre, Sidon, and all of Galilee of the Gentiles had gathered together, quote, to annihilate us. When Judas and the people heard all this, a great assembly was called to decide what they should do to assist their people who were in distress and who were being attacked by enemies. Then Judas said to Simon, his brother, "Choose your men and go rescue your people in Galilee. My brother Jonathan and I will go to Gilead." So he left Joseph, Zechariah's son, and Azariah, a leader of the people, with the rest of the forces in Judea to guard it. He commanded them, "Take charge of this people, but don't engage in battle with the Gentiles before we return." 3,000 men were assigned to Simon to go to Galilee, and 8,000 were to go with Judas to Gilead. So Simon went to Galilee, fought several battles with the Gentiles, and crushed them. He pursued them to the gate of Ptolemais. As many as 3,000 Gentiles died, and he plundered their possessions. Then he took the Jews of Galilee and Arabah, together with their wives and children and all they owned, and led them to Judea with great rejoicing. Judas Macabees and his brother Jonathan crossed the Jordan and traveled for 3 days into the wilderness. They encountered the Nabateans, who greeted them in peace and related all that had happened to their people in Gilead. Many of them have been cornered inside Bozrah and Bosor, in Alema and Caspho, in Maked and in Carmine. These were strong and large towns. Some have been confined in other towns in Gilead. The enemy is getting ready to attack the fortress tomorrow. They intend to capture and destroy all those people in a single day. So Judas and his army turned back quickly to Bozrah by the wilderness road. He took the town and killed every male by the sword. He seized all their goods and burned down the town. He left there by night and went all the way to the fortress. At daybreak, they looked around and saw a large company, too many to count, carrying ladders and war engines to use to capture the fortress. They were attacking those inside. So Judas saw that the battle had already begun and that the cries of the townspeople went up to heaven. There were trumpet blasts and loud shouts. He said to his forces, "Fight today for your people." He came up behind them in 3 companies. They sounded their trumpets and cried out in prayer. When Timothy's army realized that it was Macabees, the hammer, they ran away. But Judas dealt with them a heavy blow, and as many as 8,000 of the enemy died that day. Judas turned next to Mapha. He fought against it and took it. He killed every male in it, plundered it, and burned it with fire. After that, he marched ahead and took Chazpo, Maked, Bozor, and the other towns of Gilead. Following this, Timothy assembled another army and encamped opposite Rephan on the other side of the stream. Judas sent spies to observe the camp, and they reported, "All the Gentiles around us have gone over to him. It's a very large force." They've also hired Arabs to help them. They're camped across the stream, and they're ready to come and fight against you. So Judas went out to meet them. And as Judas and his army were drawing near to the stream of water, Timothy told the officers of his forces, "If Judas crosses the water first, we won't be able to resist him, and he'll surely defeat us. But if he hesitates out of fear and camps on the other side of the river, then we'll cross over and defeat him." Well, let's guess what Judas does. When Judas came to the stream of water, he stationed the scribes of the people there and issued this command: "Don't let anyone start to make camp. Instead, force them all to enter the battle." He then crossed over against them first, and the whole army followed him. All the Gentiles were defeated. They threw down their weapons and ran away into the sacred grounds at Carnaim. But Judas took the town and burned the sacred grounds with fire, together with all those who were hiding there. Even Carnaim was conquered, and they couldn't oppose Judas any longer. So here we have continued victories, and it's as much a spiritual battle as it is a physical one. And it's always approached with prayer and praise. And it's always done with an inferior numbers. Not by might, not by power. Judas sent them a peaceful message. Then Judas gathered all the Israelites in Gilead to go to the land of Judah. It was a very large group, both small and great, with all their wives, children, and goods. They came to Ephraim, a large and secure town along the way. They couldn't go around it on either side. They had to go through it. But the townspeople shut them out and blocked up the gates with rocks. Judah sent them a peaceful message. "Let us pass through your land to get to ours. We won't do you any harm. We'll just pass through by foot." But they still refused to open to him. So Judas ordered that the army camp wherever they were, and the forces did so. All that day and night he fought against the town, and it was handed over to him. He killed every male by the edge of the sword, and he demolished and plundered the town. Then he passed through it, walking over the dead bodies. After that, they crossed the Jordan and came to the large plain in front of Bethshan. Judas kept rallying those who fell behind and encouraged the people all along the way until he came to the land of Judah. They went up to Mount Zion with joy and gladness. They made entirely burnt offerings because they had returned safely. Not one of them had died. Now, this is what happened while Judas and Jonathan were in Gilead and their brother Simon was in Galilee in front of Ptolemais. We're about to see a story here of a misadventure. We see all these great victories and the acclaim that came with them for Judas and his brothers. So some other people are going to want to get in on that act. But they're doing it for their own glory, not for God's. So here we read the story. Joseph, Zechariah's son, and Azariah, the commanders of the forces that had remained behind, heard about their brave deeds and the war they had fought. So they said, let's make a name for ourselves too. Let's go and make war on the Gentiles around us. Now, Judas's instructions had been, nobody fight the Gentiles until I get back. Well, they are thinking they're going to get in on a little glory train here, and they're going to fight the Gentiles. They gave orders to the troops who were with them and marched against Jamnia. Gorgias and his troops came out from the town and engaged them in battle. Here's Gorgias back. His forces had already been defeated by Judas. So they're picking on somebody they thought they could already beat. Joseph and Azariah were decisively defeated, and they were pursued to the borders of Judea. As many as 2,000 Israelites died that day. As a result, the people of Israel suffered a great defeat because, wanting to do a brave thing, they didn't obey Judas and his brothers. Furthermore, they didn't belong to the family of those men through whom deliverance was given to Israel. And I will add here, and they were doing it for their own fame, to make a name for themselves. And Judas fought to glorify his God and to save his people. All Israel and all the Gentiles greatly esteemed Judas and his brothers. Wherever their name was heard, people gathered to them and praised them. But that's not why they were doing it. At that time, Judas and his brothers headed out and fought Esau's descendants in the land to the south. He struck Hebron and its villages, tore down its fortress, and burned its towers all around. He then set out to enter the land of the Philistines and passed through Marisa. That day, some priests who wished to do a brave deed died in battle because they had gone out to battle unwisely. But Judas turned aside to Azotus, to the land of the Philistines. Judas tore down their altars, and he burned the carved images of their gods with fire, and he plundered the towns, and he returned to Judah. Now, what we have next is a story, and I believe I will dive into this next week rather than chop it up. But we hear about the last days of that Antiochus, self-proclaimed Epiphanes, but more like Epimanes, the madman. And we see Daniel's prophecy about him come true, about his death. And so we need to know this story, and I'll save it for next week, but it will also make clear the fulfillment of Daniel's amazing prophecy. Can't wait to get to that. So until next week.